such a great pleasure to be here today to join you, David, and the team at the America's Future series, and actually to introduce someone who is an incredible person and an incredible friend, Vance Serchuk. And Vance has a suite of accomplishments in his life, and he's now at KKR, where he is the deputy director of the KKR Global Institute. But I've known Vance since I came to Washington in 2005. I think Vance might have been the first person I met in Washington. And I've had the great pleasure of watching his career from his time in a think tank at the American Enterprise Institute to his time on the Hill working for Senator Joe Lieberman, and then on committee staff, and then out into the broader world. His many accomplishments and achievements include a degree from that prestigious Yale Law School, which he did part-time, or I should say full-time, while also doing all of his work in Washington. And his service now actually includes service with the United States Navy. Vance is a tremendous patriot and a tremendous friend. I really feel honored to be able to interview him today and to chat with him about the geopolitical risks that face the United States at this critical moment. So Vance, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Kim, thank you so much. The pleasure and the honor is more than reciprocal. Thank you also to David for the invitation to be part of this important series. Kim, we have in fact known each other for what is now an embarrassingly long time. All I can say is that likewise, from watching the time when you first arrived in Washington, D.C., and something that you've done, which is that you've actually built something. You've built something which really, and I always cite this as an example to people, you kind of reinvented what the think tank is. You created a new model, and it was something which then has now become such an integral part of our national security ecosystem, relied upon by government, relied upon executive branch, Congress, our media. I think that there may be some rule that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, I'm not sure a day goes by that they don't have a graphic, which comes courtesy of the Institute for the Study of War. And you built all of that. And so whenever there are people going to Washington, I always cite you and the example of what ISW has become as it's a case study that innovation is possible in Washington, in our national security space. And moreover, it was the best kind of innovation in that it created and provided something that people didn't even know that they needed. But once it was there, the thought of living without it was impossible. And I can go on about the stories about you briefing people like Senator McCain and Senator Lieberman, about people from inside the executive branch, including from our intelligence community, coming and telling us, actually, to be totally candid, the work that ISW is doing, which is open source, is better than the work that we're able to produce, and we're trying to figure out how they do it. So I hope for all of those reasons, this can be a two-way conversation, not just a one-way interview, because I'm as eager to hear from you, as always, about how you're thinking about geopolitics, geopolitical risk, as well as geopolitical opportunity for the United States. Frankly, much more so than offering my own thoughts, which I'm not sure are going to live up to much. But let's get it going.
Wonderful. Well, Vance, thank you very much. That was extremely kind and a great honor. It's wonderful, I think, just to point out to everyone in the audience that it is actually possible to have long-term friends in Washington. I hope everybody gets lucky.
We haven't gotten through the discussion yet today, Kim. Let's see where we are.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Well, I thought I would actually start with a question for you because I know that you're recently back from Japan, from Tokyo. And on the one hand, I'm incredibly jealous because someday I'm going to have sushi with you in Tokyo. But in the meantime, um, what I'd really love to hear about is your thoughts from the region. You had written in a Wall Street Journal piece that the Ukraine war hasn't doomed the balance of power in Asia. Instead, it may be stabilizing it. And that's a piece that you had authored from Japan. So tell me, what do you mean by that? Why do you think that the Ukraine war may be stabilizing in Asia?
So I wrote that piece now almost a year ago
Yeah.
for a previous trip to cross the Indo-Pacific, and I described the what I wrote at the time as aspirational slash fingers crossed inspirational.
Mhm.
And the argument was basically this: there's a school of thought out there which is not, I think, unrooted in actually some reality that the biggest challenge that we face is long term, medium term from the PRC, and that anything which distracts us from that challenge, anything which draws resources away from that challenge, is a huge vulnerability, an incredible risk. And therefore, as terrible as the situation in Ukraine, as terrible as the situation might be when things arise in the Middle East, we just can't afford to get drawn in anywhere else right now. And it reflects the state of our defense industrial base. It reflects the fact that, our munition stockpiles are not what they need to be. And I agree with all of those criticisms and critiques about the state of our defense industrial base, where versus where we need to be. What I was arguing, however, was a bit of a historical, which is if you think back to the early Cold War, the principal theater of the Cold War was in Europe. And by the end of the 1940s, 1950, we had put in place a set of institutions, most importantly NATO, for that European theater to include the Article 5 security guarantee saying in the event that the Soviet Union attacked our European allies, we would be obligated then to come to their defense. The problem was that while we made those commitments, they were basically hollow. It was a bluff. We did not have the military infrastructure in Europe. We didn't have the forward presence. We didn't have the defense industrial base. We didn't have war plans. We didn't have a military commander for NATO in the event that actually that got called. So what happens? Well, what happens is the Korean War. What happens is that North Korea in 1950 invades South Korea, and all of a sudden, this turns out to be a massive wake-up call for the United States, for the West. The realization that, oh my God, we live in a world where, in fact, these communist regimes really can engage in cross-border aggression against our side of the line. And so, in addition to responding with our intervention in South Korea, we end up with NSC 68, right, which had been sitting on President Truman's desk, and he had looked at it and said, this is going to be way too expensive. I can't afford this. But in the aftermath of that North Korean attack on South Korea, what are the consequences? We end up actually putting a very large forward deployed presence into Europe for the first time since World War II. We appoint a Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, this person named Eisenhower, who had done a couple of other notable things. We actually start developing war plans to say, well, if we actually have to defend Western Europe, how would we do it? And a whole set of other things, right? So that's the consequence. And in this bizarre kind of way, this conflict, which was in a peripheral theater of the Cold War, often Northeast Asia, a place that everyone thought had secondary importance, ends up actually reinforcing the position of the United States, the West, with respect to its hard power capabilities in the principal theater of the Cold War. So my aspirational plea a year ago was to say, well, look, what can the Ukraine war do if we are try to turn this tragedy, this horrible act of aggression by Vladimir Putin to our advantage? Well, it should be a wake-up call. It should be a wake-up call about the things that we need to be doing differently, not just in the European theater, but even more importantly, in the Indo-Pacific. And the country which I think was on the leading edge of trying to kind of galvanize this response was Japan. So Japan, in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, set about make a really dramatic commitment to double its defense spending. And when you're the number three economy in the world, doubling your defense spending is actually a pretty big deal, right? This means that they're moving up, and by the end of the decade, will be, if things track out and if they're able to meet their commitments, they'll be the third largest military spender on the planet after the United States and after China. So that's a pretty profound thing for the overall military balance. And the things that they're focused on are all about how do we create a sense of deterrence. The Prime Minister Kishida's argument throughout 2022 and 2023 was, we don't want Europe's present to become Asia's future. Ukraine was a failure of deterrence. We can't afford that here, so therefore we need more hard power capability. My hope was two things. One, the Japanese government actually now has to execute on that. And it's one thing to make the pledges; it's another thing to then actually have to follow through on them. Second, my hope and my plea was that I hope that the United States also takes broader inspiration from this, and that we use the Ukraine war again as a kind of wake-up call, as we recognize that not only do we need to be able to be producing more munitions for the sake of the Ukrainians, but also because, as now is been very thoroughly and publicly reported, when there are exercises and war games about the Western Pacific, they often end in ways that are pretty unattractive because of insufficient stockpiles of things like long-range fires. As I said, as you mentioned, I was just back in Japan, and I would say that the progress has been mixed. Some good news. They are continuing and are actually making meaningful ratchets in their defense spending. So those numbers are meaningfully going up. The budget forecast for next year is about 15-16% year on year. They're actually pulling to the left certain key programs, including their domestically produced cruise missile. And the focus that they have, I think, are a lot of the right systems, which is to say long-range fires, unmanned systems, very large numbers of small things, kind of turn anti-access area denial against the PRC. So those are all positive things. They have passed a very meaningful revision of their export controls, which will allow them to sell back to the United States weapons that are produced in Japan under license, like Patriot interceptors. One of the things that we were discussing is, are there ways that can be accelerated and actually ramped up? Japan obviously has very meaningful manufacturing capabilities. And we need all of our allies that have manufacturing capabilities, that aspire to manufacturing capabilities, I think, to step in to the fore with respect to being able to add to a collective defense industrial base. But there's also still a number of things that are more challenging on the Japanese side, which we can talk about, including just the overall diminished political momentum and strength around this particular government, and some of the frictions that emerge. And then secondarily, I would say on the U.S. side, unfortunately, I think you look at sort of the state still of our defense industrial base, of some of the reforms that have been discussed but are not yet really in practice. I wish I could say that I saw sort of an NSC 68 like galvanizing change. I don't think that we're there yet. I think we're still probably under the Winston Churchill line about, Americans will do the right thing, but just after they try everything else. But look, I'd love to hear from you a bit about how you see the geopolitical landscape. And in particular, you've been spending so much time on the war in Ukraine. ISW is the go-to source for understanding what's happening in Ukraine. We seem to be at a very grim moment for the war, where 2023 obviously did not bring the gains that many people had hoped on the battlefield. there's now a bit of a deadlock in both U.S. and the EU over funding for the Ukrainians. How worried are you about what 2024 is going to bring for Ukraine?
Thank you so much, Vance. I think it's actually important to begin by stating that the war in Ukraine is actually vitally important to the security of the United States and its allies and partners in Europe. This is the first major war on the European continent that we have faced since the end of the Second World War. It is a large and bloody conflict. And American soldiers are not there on the front lines fighting and defending against Putin's unwarranted invasion of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are there defending Ukraine, and in doing so, they are actually taking a lot of military assets and depriving the Russians of their ability to use those assets elsewhere in Europe in support of Putin's expansionist and aggressive revanchist vision. And so the war is important precisely because Putin does have a revisionist vision, that he in fact does wish to undo the end of the Cold War and return to a status quo anti-Cold War ending, and status quo anti-1991, in which many of the former Soviet lands are gathered within Putin's sphere of influence. In other words, he's out there trying to revise international borders by use of force. And those are international borders that Russia agreed to in 1991 in a series of following agreements that followed. I think that's very important because the first thing that's at stake in Ukraine is the principle of sovereignty and of whether an armed aggressor can revise the international order by use of force. And we can't lose sight of that because, among other things, the world is watching to see whether or not Ukraine can withstand Putin, and whether the United States will actually stand with Ukraine in its defense and in the defense of Europe. Because if the United States does not defend Ukraine, what does that say about the United States and its willingness to defend other allies and partners, let alone our Asia-Pacific allies and partners, and those who are not in a formal alliance status, such as Taiwan? Well, Xi Jinping is watching what the United States is doing, and he is watching how we behave. Our credibility as a nation is at risk, and it is being tested right now. And Putin is triumphalist in his speeches, in his rhetoric. He is actually saber rattling and issuing threats of a low-grade kind right now against Finland, and a slightly higher grade kind against Moldova and other neighboring states. And the reason I think that's so important is that Putin is interested in Ukraine as a stepstone to Europe and as a stepstone to undermining NATO as a security alliance and undermining the credibility of the United States. So we absolutely must focus on this outcome, and we must recognize that the outcome of the war in Ukraine has huge ramifications for Asia. And as we take a look at what those ramifications could be, that is, I think, just vitally important. The second thing that I think is tremendously important here is that the Ukrainians can still win, and they can still lose. And so this war is not stalemated. It is not stalemated. It is positional. That means that there aren't large maneuvers that are able to be underway using mechanized forces on either side. But the lines are more static than we had expected, but that's artificial. That's just a product of the fact that that's a product of how much the Russians have mobilized, how much they can mobilize, and what they can't actually do. The war in Ukraine is winnable by Ukraine, and it's also losable by Ukraine. And the biggest difference between whether Ukraine wins and whether Ukraine loses is, first and foremost, whether the United States, its allies and partners in NATO, and other like-minded countries actually provide the financial and military support that Ukraine needs in order to sustain the high-scale combat operations that are actually required to continue to whittle away the Russian army at the rate that Putin is mobilizing it, and to regain maneuver capability on the battlefield, to regain some terrain. So 2024 depends, obviously it depends on the Ukrainians, but it also depends on us. And so I think we mustn't be too complacent in Washington that what is going on here in a debate and discussion is abstract. It's real, and it is protracting the conflict in Ukraine. It has caused the Ukrainians to have to go on the defensive, and it is giving Putin little gains, none of them meaningful, but little gains that actually help him boost his reputation with his people and increase the pressure of mobilization on his population.
Kim, I agree with all of your analysis. I mean, I think one of the things which is you occasionally hear is this idea that says, well, look, you know, what does it really matter in the event that you know, Ukraine is lost? It's not a member of NATO, and moreover, we have potential interests with Russia. Maybe we can try to pull them into some sort of relationship with us against China in the long run. Wouldn't we be better off if we simply were able to bury the hatchet with Russia on Ukraine, even if it's at the expense of Ukrainian sovereignty? My pushback on that has always been essentially the argument boils down to, look, if we give Ukraine to Putin, if we concede the point, then he will feel safe. And I think that the challenge with that is that when you look at the totality of Putin's history, of Russian history, the idea that you're going to be able to ever make him feel sated or secure is just really unsupported by the facts. During the Cold War, Soviet Union had half of Europe. It nonetheless felt profoundly insecure and had expansionist tendencies, which is why we had to create NATO. So the idea that, you know, they'd stop at Ukraine, I think, is just unfortunately false. So the question rather is, you know, do we try to hold the line in Ukraine, where we have a country whose population is overwhelmingly mobilized, prepared to fight, prepared to make great sacrifices, and is only asking for our support. And by the way, support which ultimately also can strengthen our own defense industrial base, right? Which will leave us better off in the long run vis-a-vis the other challenges that we face around the world. Foremost, the situation in the Western Pacific. Now, I will say, just on the broader subject of geopolitical threats, I think that the challenge that we've got right now is, you know, a world of obviously multiple crises. You know, we have a hot war, as you say, in Europe for the first time in decades. We have multiple upheaval in the Middle East. Obviously, you know, the Israeli war with Hamas, which is centered in Gaza, but also a northern front with Hezbollah, which is heating up. Iranian-backed provocations across the map, from Syria to Iraq to, most significantly for the global economy, The Houthis, who over the last now half decade have been armed to the teeth with increasingly capable weapons by the Iranians, which I think we look back in hindsight, we say we kind of looked the other way while it happened because we did not want to have to endure the costs of taking that challenge on. Now, unfortunately, we're paying some of the price of that. And I also would say, I mean, look, as we look to the Indo-Pacific, the overwhelming focus, for good reason, is on the threat posed by the increasingly capable military and intelligence capabilities of the PRC. I'm someone, though, who also spends time worrying about North Korea, particularly this year. North Korea, I fear, is kind of like what Hamas was to the Israelis. North Korea, I fear, could be for us. It's the thing that you write off. It's the thing that we say, look, they're obviously, menace, and we have to, we have to deter them, but they're not suicidal. They're not going to do anything crazy. We kind of know the playbook. Every now and then they're going to create some provocation, and we then pay for the provocation to go away. And then there's another provocation, and that's the pattern. I hope that that's true. I think regardless, we're going to have a lot more provocation because they always do ratchet things up during election years. And there's a very strong and clear historical pattern of that. But some of the rhetoric coming out of Pyongyang is also really it's new, it's different, and it's quite unsettling. And so all of this just, I think, underscores that one, there's very, very little space for complacency. Two, I think that there is still a fundamental mismatch between the capabilities that we currently have, which are very much still a post-Cold War legacy, particularly on the hard power side, and the capabilities that we need, the need for much greater innovation and resourcing to begin to try to close the gap between all of these revisionist powers, which have been, in one form or another, at war with us, working against us, in competition with us, even if we were not aware that they were actually doing all of these things, or we weren't as focused on it as we might have been. And so that's the sort of situation I think that we find ourselves in. It's very, very tough. And sadly, I think that there's much less time at our disposal than there was until if we were having this conversation just a few years ago.
Vance, I agree wholeheartedly. The United States is at a moment of great peril. Our enemies are rallying one another and creating a nexus of support for themselves. That poses great risk to the United States, but we also have great opportunity if we actually recognize that this is an early warning, that we are not ready for what the world is bringing our way, that we actually have to prepare our defense industrial base, that it has to be a common one across like-minded peoples and states, and that if we act now, we still act in time to preserve our strength, our safety, and our way of life. But our enemies are going to keep that at risk. And I think you have put that incredibly eloquently. So Vance, thank you so much for joining us today and for all of your insights into things geopolitical. And thank you for everything that you do in service to the United States.
Kim, the thanks are mutual. As I said, I'm not sure how any of us would live without ISW these days. So while the world is in turmoil, we at least see that there is the possibility for innovation to begin to understand those challenges, and that understanding at least is the beginning of then being able to do what we need to do in response to those challenges. So thank you so much. Thanks for the privilege of this conversation.
Thank you.